connected with each other and are connected with each other in a deep way and connected with the entire universe. I also have a foundation belief that nature is medicine. Of course, many people have written about this, and if we've been given, of the many gifts that we're given, the beauty of the earth and the grandeur of the landscape is incredible. And a few weeks ago, when we saw Sister Marla's presentation on the secret life of trees, it made me reflect a lot upon this idea also. But walking in the forest, sitting on a rock and overlooking the landscape, walking on the shore of Lake Superior, and even in places that are less grand, that as we get outside of the four walls that we tend to live in and have the sky at our head rather than the ceiling, that we become connected with the earth in the way that I think we were intended to become. And again, we don't have to go to grand landscapes to perceive this, but I think that if we have an awareness that nature is medicine, that we can heal ourselves and get connected to our authentic self. The other appreciation I really have is that it's important, I think, to travel humbly. And I recently was, again, traveling with my daughter, and it was an incredible trip because we did all the national parks of the Southwest, which I've done many times before. And there's one place in particular at Zion National Park called the Angel's Landing. And I like the term Angel's Landing, but it's also one of the popular t-shirts where I survived Angel Landing. And basically it goes up a bunch of switchbacks, and it's incredible scenery. But the last a couple hundred yards or maybe longer than that goes to the actual Angel Landing. And it's very steep, and there's like a cable where you can hang on to get up there. And I have to confess that my balance isn't as good as it used to be, and I've been on top of Angel's Landing maybe 20 times in my life. And I let my daughter do the last stretch, the last part to Angel's Landing on her own. And I recognized that, I didn't need to do it for my ego anymore. But I also recognized, particularly through most of my life, that a lot of the things that I have done and the reason I have done them is because of ego. And I'm trying to live a lot more in spirit these days than in ego. And again, it's a bit of a surrendering perhaps, but it's also, I think for me, it's becoming vulnerable, which I'm hoping is helping me be a little bit better person, but being humble rather than arrogant. The other thing I figured out, but it took me a while to get there, is that all of us are a lot more alike than different. And actually this happened to me when I was working in the villages in Alaska and basically working in Indian Eskimo villages. And I think that in the first couple of years as a healthcare provider working cross-culturally, that I thought that I was different. And I don't like to say that I thought that I was better, but maybe in some way I might have than the people that I was living with and taking care of. And then, and someday, in fact, it may have been another divine inspiration where an angel whispered into my ear in the middle of the night when I recognized that, hey, we're all alike, that we all want someone to love us, and we want to love someone. We all need to have a sense of purpose. All of us have red blood, and we have a heart that beats, and hopefully a heart that cares. But it shouldn't be a big jump, I guess, but it was a little bit of a jump at some point much earlier in my life that we're all a lot more alike than different. I particularly reflect on that today because, again, we're living in such a time of chaos, which hopefully will lead to a change for the better. But the division and the conflict and the disagreement amongst people, which it's in many times it's become not only disagreement, but it's become hatred and having to carry automatic weapons and knives to try to protect ourselves or whatever. But if we can all embrace the idea that all of us need the same things in our life, and that is a sense of purpose and a sense of love, people that we care about and care about us, and we need to get a good night's sleep and hopefully adequate nutrition and our spirituality and the music, dance, and poetry in our lives. is something, regardless of the culture or the color of our skin, is important. So for me, it's another foundation health, or it's a foundation issue in my life and probably in yours. This is a quotation which I really like because it helps me reflect on this idea of gratitude. And in Brother David's presentation about the grateful for the day, is that to wake up in the morning or to go to bed at night or to have that moment when you just are so filled with gratitude for this moment and for this day and for this place and for our life. It's so important. I believe this is a Thomas Merton quotation, but it's a good reflection. I also believe that the path to happiness is through gratitude. And, a lot of times we perceive that happiness is what we're chasing after. And whether it is or it isn't, it comes to us if we live gratefully. So I do believe that the path to happiness is really living in gratitude. This photograph was taken at the Monterey, California aquarium, and I thought it was pretty cool because, again, the human hand is on the aquarium glass, but the jellyfish are on the other side. And it's the way that we're connected with all living things in the universe, and not only the things that we can perceive as having the life that we understand, but maybe with the rocks and with the trees and the plants and with the oceans and things that maybe don't seem like life forms to us, but I do believe still have a spirit. Again, in living in gratitude, this was a poem, but I perceive it as a prayer, and I'd like to ask all to kind of read this either quietly or out loud with me, but it's in praise and gratitude. And it goes, "Holy earth, holy cosmos, I bow before you with my whole being. Holy creatures, holy nature, I kneel upon the earth in honor and thanksgiving of your blessed bounty. Holy waters, holy mountains, I lay my body on your temple in gratefulness for nurturing my tender soul. Holy passion, holy longing, I rise up before you, a devotee of truth, following wherever you lead me. Holy earth, there we go. Holy silence, holy solitude, I place my hands over my heart, breathing in serenity, breathing out peace. Holy sorrow, holy suffering, I close my hands in prayer. May I bear every wound with compassion and non-harm. Holy humility, holy emptiness, I bow my head before you. I have become nothing for your all to shine in my soul. Holy freedom, holy rejoicing, I open my heart to the world, offering myself to this day in joyfulness and gratitude. Amen." One thing I do reflect upon is that certainly we can read poems, we can read prayers, we can say prayers, but basically any conversation we have with our higher power is a prayer. And part of it is to take a pause in our life to just give thanks and to live in gratitude and to have a conversation with our higher power. I do believe for sure that our whole being is really mind, body, and spirit, and we are connected not only with each other, but with the universe. We walk alone and we walk together. Our journey is towards eternal life, our spiritual journey of dreaming and discovering and of loving. And the question becomes, and many people have written about this or reflected upon it, are we spirits having a human experience to learn and to teach, to transform the world? Or is our human body all that we are? And that's one of the things that I can't answer for others, but would offer for reflection for us all. We all are on the eternal the journey towards the eternal life. And again, sometimes to discover our sense of purpose, sometimes to find love and to be able to find love and live love in our life. But in our ways of journeying, we are seekers. In our life journey, we travel from shadow to light and from light to shadow. And our trail may be different, but our destination is the same. And I mean the light to the shadow to the light and the light to shadow in a spiritual sense, and in our lives in terms of grief and happiness, sorrow and suffering and loss. the things we have in our life. But again, in the natural world, it's I find a lot of connections myself in terms of the symbolism of, and the sort of the metaphor of what's tangible and I'm able to experience with my body that feeds my soul. This is a slot canyon in the Southwest, and again, this was actually about 2 months ago, which is a little bit early to be in the Southwest as far as not quite the peak season, and actually for the Southwest a little bit on the cold side. So it was pretty remarkable going from the shadow of the canyon into the sunlight. You could definitely perceive the temperature difference and then the difference between dark and light. But so too, I think, is our life, and so too has my life been as I reflect upon it. So I'd offer that as another particle of something to reflect upon. We are travelers and traveling towards the eternal life and through wisdoms. And the path that we walk is a path that our ancestors have walked. But even though our ancestors may have walked there before, and hopefully we have some of their wisdoms, we also are breaking our own trail. And perhaps as we break our own trail and walk the path of our ancestors, part of our responsibility is to share that with those that are coming after us, to share that with our children, and to share the wisdoms that we've acquired, because we all are in a shared journey, whether we're of sages or whether or not we're the innocent. So what is the journey? This is another quotation that speaks to me. Maybe the journey isn't so much about becoming anything. Maybe it's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you, so you can be who you're meant to be in the first place. Many of the things that I read kind of share with the fact that there's nobody that can be a better you than you. So, but a lot of times, again, we're not our authentic selves. We aren't willing or able or haven't yet been humble to embrace the concept of vulnerability, to be who we really honestly are, and to let that and let others in, or to let ourselves even into ourselves. The other reflection I have is, particularly in these times that we have right now with concerns about climate change and the pandemic and all the other chaoses that are there, again, and I embrace these things with the idea that chaos precedes change, and I have optimism and faith and hope that change will be for the better. Maybe we'll be a stronger society and a stronger people. And again, the stories of some of the compassion that I see of people sharing during this time is there. But also, I do reflect a lot on climate change, and actually I reflect on my own responsibility to do what I can. When I was still working as a physician, I would be on call quite often, and actually for an emergency room call at the hospital here in Tomahawk, we do 48 hours, a Saturday and Sunday, 2 days in a row. So start on Saturday morning and go home on Monday morning. And we had a call room, which is quite comfortable. It had a reclining chair, which we spent a fair bit of time when we weren't on our feet or in front of a computer screen or having a stethoscope in our ears. But in that call room, basically, it's pretty much where we live for 2 days. And there was just an office-sized garbage can in there. And I started to recognize after a few times in that call room that in the course of a weekend, that the number of styrofoam cups that I used and paper plates and wrappers of various food products was pretty remarkable. I also would take my paper bag full of my junk mail, which I accumulated for a week or so before I was on call, since the time I was on call before. And it would be before the weekend was up that 3 or 4 garbage cans full of things would be filled up. And now that we're trying to make a better attempt at recycling at our house, I just am, again, humbled and amazed by how much we generate in so little time. And again, it makes me reflect on what do I really need in my life, and how much excess we tend to live with. But I also reflect upon that we together as a people are just sharing this time together, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, and we're sharing the earth. And the earth it's given to us perhaps as the greatest gift. It's the Garden of Eden in a grand sense. It provides our food and provides our the footing underneath our feet, and a place for us to build our homes and to raise our kids, to experience love and to share our reflections and to celebrate our sense of consciousness and feed our spirit. So I hope that others like myself do reflect on the importance of us taking care of the place we live and the wonder that we have of just sharing this time together as people. When I think about the earth, I don't belong to the flat earther group, so I like the idea of the fact that the earth is probably round. But it also takes me to the concept of the circle, which is one of my favorite symbols, because if we think about all of us hand to hand, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, as a point on the circle, that if even one of us falls off the circle is broken. And the circle is only strong when it's intact. But also, as we stand around the perimeter of a circle, the distance is the same to the middle for all of us. So it's a good symbol, and it's something to reflect upon in many ways, the circle of life, from birth to bearing fruit to finally passing on and leaving seeds behind, as us gardeners are reflecting upon. It reflect upon the seasons, reflect upon the circle of life, and many other things. So we walk hand in hand, and we're walking each other home to that eternal life. The other thing I enjoy about thinking about circles is campfire circles. And a number of years ago, I was on a hike with a bunch of friends. We were in the Brooks Range in Alaska, which is, again, one of the remarkable wild places still left on the earth. And it was a very awesome hike. And basically, it was one of those trips where I was with 3 or 4 other people. And when we're on these types of hikes, a lot of times 2 people will walk together side by side and share some stories and reflect and maybe point out something that the other person may have not seen and have those deep discussions. At other times, maybe there's many feet or even yards or maybe even a mile or so between people in the group. So we walk alone and we walk together. But at the end of the day, when we make camp, frequently, maybe not in this trip in the Brooks Range because there's pretty much a scarcity of wood for making campfires, but in other places we make campfires. And even in our Northwood celebration, many people do bonfires. And again, the symbolism of the fire in my mind is that first off, it takes us to our primeval self before screens, but it also brings us together as shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, person to person, to share the fire and to share the heat. And we share our stories and we share our mythology and we share our wonder with the universe and sometimes try to explain our own creation and our belief about just in general about supernatural things. It also, for some cultures, is a place of celebration. In fact, I think sometimes even as teenage white guys with too much Pabst Blue Ribbon, it may cause some celebration around the campfire with deep reflections where people dance and sing songs. But it is a gathering place, and again, it's symbolic and it's a place to share stories. And that's sort of the context of my presentation today, is this idea of some storytelling, not so much because it's my story, but because I think that these are universal stories. I had mentioned earlier in the presentation about vulnerability leading to intimacy. And part of that vulnerability and intimacy occurred in what for me was a fairly dramatic time in my life. At the time I was living in Palmer, Alaska, which is just north of Anchorage, and actually it was the heart of the Matanuska Valley, which was settled by a lot of Midwestern farmers that were allowed to homestead in the Matanuska Valley with the idea of developing agriculture there. Palmer today is almost a suburb or a feeder community to Anchorage, and many people live in the Matanuska Valley and drive to Anchorage to go to work in cubicles and office jobs and other things. But it was a place that was basically fairly rural community when I lived there in the very early 1970s. And I was going through some time in my life where I was doing a lot of deep reflection about, first off, I was alone, had no significant other. In fact, my best friend in the world was one of my lead dogs named Toke. And we went everywhere together. And He actually, I described him as being a Zen master because he taught me how to travel. And I really do believe that, and do believe in the spirit of animals being our teachers and companions. And it was perhaps he was a therapy dog before people used that terminology. But at any rate, I was going through a time of some sort of troubled times or reflective times in my life. And again, my medicine I perceived even at that point in my life was really in nature. Plus, at that time, well before I was 40 years old, in fact, only about half that age, that I didn't have a sense of being mortal. In fact, one of the reflections I've had as a physician is that most of us don't understand the concept of mortality until we're about 40. And that's part of the reason at 19 years old we make good soldiers, because we think we're stronger than bullets. But at any rate, I decided that I need some time in nature, and it was winter in February. So the days were getting longer at the northern latitudes, but they still were cold, and the night was still much longer than the day. And one of my favorite spiritual places has always been Denali, the great one, Mount McKinley, or Denali as it's called, Mount McKinley National Park or Denali National Park. And it also is a wild place. And if anyone's been there in the last several years, it's been much more developed than it was 40 or 50 years ago, with some resorts and restaurants and things around by the park headquarters. But at the time, in the early 1970s, there was the park headquarters building and the park hotel and a gas station. That was pretty much it. So it was a wild place. And in the winter, there are no trails or anything there. The Park Service uses their dog team to more for fun than anything, but they put a few trails in with their dog team. But as soon as the wind blows, the trails are gone. And there's no formal cross-country ski trails. There's no snowmobiling. And essentially, very few people go into the park in the winter. But I decided that I needed some time at the base of the mountain. So in the base of the mountain, when I say that, it's about 80 miles away from where the mountain really is, but it feels like the base of the mountain because it's certainly a lot bigger than you are if you're standing on the horizon. So I took my cross-country skis and a backpack filled with essentials, and took my trusty lead dog Toke, and started out on a February day, filled with reflections in my head, looking for some peace and maybe some understanding of the direction my life was going to go. In one way, it was my attempt at a spiritual journey. So I cross-country skied for the day and went to Savage River, which is about 10 to 12 miles in from the start of where the park road ended, into what's a campground in the summertime. But it's a gorgeous place and great views of McKinley, and it's pretty. The river there even flows in the winter, at least in places because of the current in the springs. And what I had for my shelter was a backpacking tent, which is made out of ripstop nylon, which as far as R value or insulating value is R0. Basically, a nylon tent protects you against the wind and maybe if it snows, but it has no ability to hold heat. And I did have a pretty good winter sleeping bag, and wasn't entirely what they would call a Chachaco or greenhorn as far as traveling in the winter in Alaska. And again, I still had that sense of not being vulnerable at that point in my life, and had more confidence and common sense. So I skied into Savage River, and it was a beautiful day. It was maybe 4 or 5 degrees above zero and totally blue sky. And I knew as the sun set that it would get colder, but I guess I didn't appreciate at the moment in the afternoon how cold that really would be. Well, as the sun set and a few first stars started to show themselves, I celebrated the sunset and the star rising for a short while, and then crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. I did leave my dog into the tent for companionship, but also maybe to share some body heat with. And I had a book along, so I used my headlight and read a book for 20 minutes and then fell asleep, probably still very early in the night. And I'm uncertain about the time, because it was the time in my life where I didn't live so much compartmentalized as I had in years beyond that with carrying a watch And basically my day was pretty well defined by sunrise and sunset. But anyway, at some point during the middle of the night, I woke up just shivering almost as hard as I had ever shivered, and feeling colder than I almost had ever felt to that point in my life. And I started to really recognize that, number one, I'm not so sure I'm going to make it through the night, and started to embrace this concept of hypothermia, and put on the remaining few clothes that I had along to try to think that that might do some good. But the reality is it didn't. And the two things that happened, one is that lead dog that was sharing the tent with me, I pulled them a little closer, and I at least symbolically could feel his heartbeat right next to mine, and I certainly shared the heat that he had. I also played the scene from the classic Jack London story called To Build a Fire, where a guy who had a certain degree of arrogance traveled when it was colder than the old timers say he should travel, and ended up perishing in the cold, and was thinking maybe that would be my fate. At any rate, I appreciated the company of the dog and the body heat that he shared, but it wasn't really enough to stop my shivering, and I was really cold. And there wasn't really an opportunity for a campfire, and the reality is that campfires in that country are usually not, or difficult, because there's not much wood to have. So after some reflection, and some deep reflection about wondering if I was going to make it through the night or not, I decided my chances of staying warm out of the sleeping bag were better than my chances of being in the sleeping bag. And I thought that if I ran in place or ran circles around the tent or stomped my feet up and down, that it would make me warmer. And perhaps in a way that it did, but the warmth that I felt maybe wasn't so much in terms of what my body temperature was, but it was instead that as I emerged from the tent and looked at the sky above me and around me and in front of me and the scene there, that I recognized, perhaps for one of the very first times in my life, that I was connected to the entire universe. There were more stars in the sky than I think I ever saw before. A whisk of northern lights was dancing across the sky, and a faint bit of sliver of moonlight lit Mount McKinley or Denali. And it was such a powerful moment of just the grandeur of the landscape and the wonder of the universe, that I recognized how privileged I was to be having this experience right in that moment. And it was in my vulnerability and being stripped down to the fact that I wasn't really sure if I was going to see a sunrise again, that I became connected with everything that surrounded me. And it was a very powerful time. And in some ways, I felt as though that I heard music in the universe. And then I sort of tried to be poetic about it. And I felt as though that my voice is one voice in the choir of many voices. And since that moment of inspiration in my life, and in that moment of vulnerability, I carry that concept, and I've carried that concept through all the days of my life. And I share that story not because I feel that I have any wisdom that is better than anyone else's, but just perhaps as my story to allow you to reflect on your story. I think that we all need to have sacred places. And for me, one of my sacred places was Denali. And I go there sometimes when I was reflecting on things. I go there to celebrate happiness. I go there just because it's a cool place, and it's a grand mountain, and it makes me feel alive and feel small, but yet feel big. And I think all of us need these spiritual places and sacred places where we can go for reflection. This is a photograph from the inside of the cathedral in Denver, Colorado, where the Pope went during the International Day of Peace some years ago. And it's a beautiful chapel with the stained glass windows. And I think that this is the way we celebrate God sometimes, man to God. And then I think about the redwoods, and I think about this is the way that God celebrates us, God to man, the great gifts and the wonder that we have been given. So it's time for me to stop talking and to start to listen and to take a bit of a pause. And I'd like to open up for discussion if anyone would care to share, and I hope that everyone does. Is there a time that you felt connected with the entire universe? Perhaps maybe in a warmer place in Alaska in the winter, but a time in your life where you were one voice in the voice of many voices. So I'll turn it over for discussion at this point. And if I'm thinking about how to do this, do I change my screen somehow, Grant? Or oh, I can't hear you actually. So, okay. Okay, so what's happening? How can I get everybody's picture on the screen? I'll just escape. Okay. Okay, that's good. Okay.
Would you be able to repeat your question again, Ron?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So if I was wondering if there was a time, and hopefully that everyone will have something to share, if there's a time when you felt connected with the universe, this idea of I'm one voice and the voice of many, the choir of many voices, or the, the voice of the choir of the universe, a time of vulnerability, perhaps, where you felt connected with everything.
I guess I could jump in here, and just thinking about this stay at home, and I live in the Timber Ridge area by Minocqua, and just the path in between the trees and everything, it's just really gave me a greater appreciation for nature, and especially now that the frogs and the peepers are coming out, and to feel the heat from the sun. I've caught myself a number of times like whoa, it's a beautiful part of God's creation. And then even as recently as last night, if it wasn't the full moon, it's pretty close, and my family. Well, we sat in our bedroom where we had the two windows, and we could just look at the full moon. And usually our daughters are so energetic at night and everything, but I just laid down on the bed and looked at the moon, and they're like, "Dad, what are you doing?" I says, "Oh, I'm just awing at the moon." And I think we as a family laid there for about 45 minutes until the moon moved, so it was behind the wall and everything. So and then we talked about the planets and the stars and just the grandness of the universe and how small we are in it.
Yeah, great.
Ron, I so identify with much of what you've presented. I've been to Alaska a few times, and the end of the road in the park, and walked a few miles beyond toward Denali. And there's so many things that you've presented. And one of the things that came to my mind is we get so late smart. It seems that the first many decades of my life were spent just surviving, accumulating, and advancing. And then in the later years, we certainly do appreciate what we have today. Your experience with many of the indigenous folks must have had a tremendous effect on your spirituality. I've spent some time also with some indigenous folks, either in this nation and also up in Alaska, that, the indigenous tribes, the folks, have a great deal to teach us with their connection with nature. And I think the religions of the indigenous have something to teach Christianity. And I feel we need to be more open to accept many of the precepts of the indigenous faiths. So thank you very much for that presentation. You have indeed reminded me of my roots and the nature surrounding us in which we pay a significant part. Thank you, Ron.
Sure. Yes, to share a little bit more about living in the villages with Indians and Eskimos. When I first started traveling to the villages weren't electrified yet, so people still hauled their water out of the river, and you basically heated their homes with firewood. And again, I had this sense that I was doing something good, and I guess in my own way of thinking, perhaps I was, because I was bringing medical care to those communities. But then a deeper reflection I had sometime later is that basically, this has been a group of people and a culture who survived in the most harshest environments, and not only survived, and of course they did go through things like diphtheria epidemics and probably times of scarcity where their mortality rate was high at young ages. On the same side of it, they were self-reliant people that were connected with the land that they lived on in a way that allowed them to survive. So some of the things that I learned first off is that, before Enlightenment, it's haul water, chop wood, and after Enlightenment, it's still haul water, chop wood. But the other thing is that there really is a celebration of the seasons. Like in the spring, the ducks and the geese and the swans and the cranes all come back, and the salmon run up the river in the spring. And if you're not on a river with salmon, there's some other fish that's one of your food resources. To know where to catch those fish and how to catch them is your survival. To put food into your cash to get you through the winter is important. And again, for us these days, we put our gold dust in the bank to try to get us through the winter or through our retirement. But for people in the villages, it was a subsistence lifestyle, and it was just kind of getting through the season. And you celebrate every day and do what needs to be done. It was a great privilege to be in that environment, and it's some of the fondest days of my life. And also, I did get a broader perception on medicine, and that is that there was certain weeds that grew on the tundra and certain plants that grew in the forest, just like you hear about folks who live in the jungle, that they used for therapeutic reasons. And again, to be closed-minded about differences or whatever it just doesn't have any benefit to anyone. I think what your belief system is what works for you. So it was a great privilege, and I appreciate what you're saying. Anyone else have some experience where they felt connected with the universe?
This is Jan, and two things came to mind. One is an opportunity I had probably a little short of 20 years ago. I was acquainted with a fellow through the Quaker meetings who was very much into astronomy, and he actually had a viewing station and a telescope at his farm south of Merrill. And he invited us out there, us meaning the Quaker group, out there one evening to take advantage of seeing the stars. And it was astounding to have that quality of telescope bring the sky that close. It was profound and very moving. So there was certainly a sense of awe in that. So that's one thing that came to mind with your question, Ron. And then the other thing that came to mind, and a couple of you have heard this story before, but it just jumped out again. This is about 35 years ago, and I was on Saturdays would clean a resort for a friend or with a friend. And it was maybe 10 miles from my home, and I took a back country road up here in Eagle River to get to the resort. Back in those days, cheap transportation for our family was motorcycles. So I had taken the motorcycle to work that day. We cleaned, we had our lunch break, and at lunch we were talking about an accident that had happened in Eagle River that week where a young man unfortunately had died in a motorcycle accident. And we finished cleaning. I left to go back home on Highway X, and began very quickly to see animal movement that was very unusual. I can't remember precisely everything that I saw, but there were a number of incidents within about 10 minutes. I think there was a fox that darted into the brush on the side of the road. There was a deer on the road. This is 2 in the afternoon, so it was rather unusual. There was a robin that swooped low over the road, and I finally said, okay, I'll slow down. And I thought, okay, maybe I'm just spooked because of this conversation we had over our lunch. And it was probably not more than a half mile up the road on a very sharp right-hand turn by Honey Rock Camp that there was a car parked in my lane. And as I came up to that, I had no choice but to veer into the lane that would have been oncoming traffic. I missed the front of the vehicle by about 6 to 12 inches with my knee. If I had not been going a little bit slower speed, thanks to those animals, I would have probably ended up over the hood. So I was just profoundly struck by the messengers that were sent to me that day to keep me safe. And Al and I had taken a ride on Highway X, and still to this day, it's like, yep, that's the corner. That's the curve. So it was a level of connection that I've come to really appreciate much more even since then. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jan. Anyone else have a connection?
When you were mentioning,
okay.
When Jan was mentioning the stars, I don't remember when it was. I think I just remember laying out in the field and being amazed by all the stars. Usually we get quite a few out here in the country where I live. And one night, just kind of being amazed that all of that was out there and I was here, and still as I was, I'm still a part of all of them. And somehow we're all connected. And then last fall, I went out, well, anyways, in the fall, I knocked out, and again, it was a starry night. And I just sat, looked at the stars, and I thought, well, I'm just going to lay down and look at them. So I laid down on a wood pile, which isn't exactly as comfortable as an air mattress, but it worked. And just laid there and looked at the stars, and I thought, I think I can hear them breathing. That's it.
Okay, great.
I think one thing that strikes me about the Southwest of the United States, as well as of Alaska, is that it often appears that we see the big, broad sky that kind of makes a person feel like you're almost walking in the universe. That's a part that I have come to feel privileged to have experienced, and I just find myself kind of turning into silence because of the immensity and the huge space that the universe seems to be when we can only see maybe a little crack of it, but still it really broadens one's soul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, sister. Does anybody need to take a break? We're probably about halfway through here. I see we've got about a little less than an hour left. I can go back on the slides then. Grant, should I just start the slideshow again, or do you have to do a share screen or something? Or
Go back to the share screen and you should be ready to go.
okay, let's see. Share screen. I'm still trying to find out where everything is here. Share screen. There it is. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Share screen.
You're doing great, Ron.
Okay. Let's see. Now I can't find my cursor. Oop. I somehow got lost here, so let me try this again. Let's see. Am I on shared screen? Is it working?
No.
Okay. Okay, share screen.
Are you on the Zoom page? There you go.
Okay, we got it now. Okay, here we go. So besides just the time when you've been connected with the universe, I was going to do the question, where are your spiritual places, or what is your sacred place? You know, for some of us, it is walking in the woods or going to a mountain or the ocean. But I also would suggest that it doesn't have to be a place of a grand landscape or a place like that. Sometimes we can go to a sacred place in our head. I'll just leave that for reflection. So the presentation was called Mind, Body, and Soul, and I wanted to address that a little bit, and that is that in my work as a family practice doctor, that you know, a lot of the work that we did had, at least I think a lot of the work of physicians in our healthcare system really focuses on the body. And I do remember walking around the hallways of medical school at the University of Washington and looking at these chemical or these biochemical pathways in cartoons they had of the, you know, how this worked with that, and looked at electron micrographs and all. And again, sort of a reductionist model of trying to understand life and health and wellness at microscopic or submicroscopic level. But a lot of times in looking at the detail and reflecting a lot on kind of what science might be, is that we lose the concept of the whole person. And I particularly became troubled later in my career. In fact, I have to say what contributed to my retirement wasn't so much any fatigue about taking care of people and just being there to serve, but really more this idea that, you know, I think frequently now people will see doctors without ever having the doctor or physician or provider touch them. You know, again, to you know, hold your hand or feel your pulse or to put a stethoscope on your body is becoming more rare. And the default position is, let's order a CT scan or let's get some lab work. And again, sometimes in my cynical thinking, I think, well, you know, if you get the CT scan, that generates $1,500 for the hospital, and, you know, a few extra dollars for the doctors to read the CT, and on and on. And there's good reasons to use our technology. It does help us find things earlier, and lab work is good. But again, I think what starts to get lost is this humanistic aspect of what healthcare is. And in my foundation, I always perceive the idea that that being a healer, in healing being more than just a prescription or a procedure, that it had more to do with providing an environment of dialogue and reflection and of education. At any rate, I also do believe that we're mind, body, and spirit, and I'm going to share a few concepts of that. As far as our mind goes, you know, they claim that, you know, one thing that's unique about us as a species is that we can kind of reflect on our own existence, and we can have our anxieties and worries about the future, and have our traumas from the past kind of haunt us and change our whole life. Particularly in the years when I was raising sled dogs, I used to look out there at the dogs and think, you know, not a bad life just kind of sitting on top of your dog houses, dreaming about, you know, your Siberian Husky friend that's coming into heat. But I don't know, you know, I sort of really wonder, what do animals think? You know, you know, I'm not opposed to the concept that, you know, plants and animals and even the rocks do have spirits, and, you know, perhaps there is, you know, a sense of consciousness, but our minds are certainly more than just the control centers for our body. It really is the way that we reflect on things. And for my mind to get uncluttered and to reflect, I do find, again, that the best medicine is really that of nature. To go for a walk, to sit at the base of a tree, an elder tree, as sometimes they'd be called, and sort of have the wisdoms and the quietness and whatever else comes to us in that moment be there. So we are certainly our mind, and we are our body, which is really something to celebrate. And so much of the time we take our bodies for granted. Like, we don't even think about our eyes much because we don't have a sensation or feeling of anything in our eye, and we, look at things all the time. But at the same side of it, we take it for granted it just works until you get a corneal abrasion or you get something in your eye, and then your eye, kind of hurts, or until you get your cataract and your vision becomes foggy. So our body is certainly a collection of cells and organs and flesh and bone and muscle and nerve and heart and lungs. But our body, in one sense, is really just a vehicle that carries us from place to place, or carries us on this journey through our physical human being life to eternal life. And it perhaps is just the vehicle and the vessel for our spirit and soul. So whether or not we're on our snowshoes or skis or fat tire bike, or just have on our bare feet and walking on the pine needles, again, I offer just the reflection to celebrate your body and the wonderful gift that we've been given with our mobility and with our senses. When it comes to soul, I really for sure believe that we have a soul, but yet how to offer an image of that was beyond my imagination. And again, how to define it is also something that I'm challenged by. So in that context, I really had a discussion question out, what is soul? And, I guess I have some theories about it, but I'm not going to share those. But I would be curious to know if anyone else has something to share about what their idea of what soul is, or what our soul is. Maybe it's a question you'll need to take on your next walk with you, as I probably will.
Ron, there was a saying that I had heard a few years ago, something about connecting to the part of me that's always been. And that struck me pretty profoundly. And I sometimes will do that. I'll, come close to my heart, hand on heart, and just try and tap into that part of me that's always been. And that's probably the closest I could get to coming up with what it might be. And it was more of a feeling than it was a description, words.
Right. Well, that's great. And actually, I have to share my gratitude for everyone in this audience, because I really have gained wisdoms from all of you in the sharings and the presentations you've done. And Jan, I do remember there's a number of sort of quotations and ideas that I've taken from your presentations. And Pat, you've always done some powerful work. And Sister Marla, I guess the joy that I have with traveling with you all today through this short time is really just that we are all learning together, and we're all, together sharing this time on earth and trying to be the best we can be. So I'm not so sure what soul is or what it means, but I think that, I reflect upon it. And I also try to distinguish, and part of it is the language we use, but is there a difference between spirit and soul? Some people, I think, are more comfortable using the word spirit than they are soul, because soul does seem to be a little harder to define. But again, we can take.
Can I offer something?
Absolutely, please.
Can I offer something?
Yes.
Because I think it's a wonderful question. What is soul? And I really like what Jan just said. And I think when I grew up, there was somehow this thing like this soul. It wasn't like a garment, but somehow, I don't know if you could take it on or off. And then sometimes in grade schools, kids have this flat, it's just a piece of paper, and then it's like a little figure, and then they send it to people, and then, you're supposed to, like my nephew sent, his name was Ryan, it was Flat Ryan, will you do things, and then you send it back, and then they share what their classmates were Flat Ryan had been. And in some ways, I think that I see my soul as kind of like this flat thing that you could pick up or put on, and then Yeah, I think I've moved beyond that, and then I don't think it's so much a thing, and then I think, is it more like a space, um, uh, or is it a way of being? Um, so it's a good question. I don't know how to answer it, but I know that it used to be, um, like something you could fold up and maybe stick in a drawer or something like that. But it was always with you. But I don't see it that so much that way anymore.
Yeah, it is one of those things that it probably is defined differently by all of us, but what the definition is questionable. I did do an internet search on that and to find what I could come up with, and this was a few that sort of stood out. One is a sum of experiences and perception of those experiences, joy and sadness, happiness and pain. One was a place of peace that can experience the world as a wonder and your life as a magical event. And your soul is who you inherently are, and is part of yourself that is connected to all creation. I like the idea of this connected to all creation just because it's sort of the context of my presentation, that all is one and one is all. Yeah, it's good that we have these things to ponder, because again, it gives us another reason to spend quiet time in solitude, but also time together as people just around the campfire, actually, to share some of our ideas. This is a pretty interesting story, and this is a book I bought because it appealed to me. One is I'm always trying to work on my own personal fitness as far as a fit body, but this was a book that was written by a guy named Mark Allen, Fit Body, Fit Soul. And he actually is a world-class triathlete, probably one of the top in the world. He and his book starts out talking about how he ran for 6 times. He ran the Ironman contest in Hawaii, which is sort of the premier Ironman event, and that's where you run a marathon, you swim the ocean, and bike for 100 miles. And he came in second 6 times in a row. And the guy who was his nemesis, who always beat him, I'm trying to think, the guy's name might have been Rick Scott. Well, he was in his 7th triathlon, and he was doing very well. He was like dominant, or him and Rick Allen or Rick Scott were 1 and 2 in the swimming and with the biking, and they were up to the marathon part of it, and it was hot and humid, and Mark Allen was like 8 seconds behind Rick Scott, and he had him in sight, and he's incredibly good shape. He ate all the right food, and he worked out and very dedicated to his training. And his entire life really was to be a world-class triathlete. Well, anyhow, as the race progressed, he just was unable to close the time between himself and this other fellow, and is just 8 seconds behind, and he was so close, and he kept on hoping that the other guy was going to crash and burn, but that wasn't happening, and they were getting into the last couple miles of the contest, and it was hot, and he was probably dehydrated, as the other guy was hot and dehydrated also, and he was still hopeful, but also getting more and more discouraged with every couple hundred yards that passed that he wasn't closing the distance. And he was already starting to, in his head, feel as though that he failed, and he wasn't ever going to do this again because he didn't want to come in second, again. And then he had some sort of magical event happen where he started to recognize that he basically had what I would almost describe as an out-of-body experience. Now, I have to say that I'm paraphrasing this, because as I look through the 200 books that I have at my house to try to find this book again, I wanted to be more accurate with my description of what had happened. But essentially, he sort of understood for the first time in his life that it was more than just his body, that it had to do with his state of mind, and to really envision the idea that he was a success and not a failure. And then he had this sort of soul experience or spiritual experience where he recognized, again, he was connected with the universe. As it turned out, he ended up beating Rick Scott. He won his first triathlon after 6 attempts, and then he went on to win the next 6 years in a row. But what he did after he won the Ironman is he went and spent time with a shaman in Mexico for a year, and basically started to eat what they would call tribal food, basically, food from the land that wasn't, processed. He also changed his training and started to embrace the idea of nature, again, as nature being the medicine. And it's a pretty powerful book, and he has like 7 or 8 wisdoms that kind of came out of it. One is to go faster, slow down. So it's sort of a lot of the things were like a contradiction to what you would think. But he found as he became a little less intense in terms of his speed and his training and slowed down, that he was able to run faster or to be faster in his running. He also is one of these athletes, and there's been many of them since that are you read about, even guys like Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, that they've more of embraced plant-based diets versus it used to be that you had to eat 3 pounds of raw meat and raw liver in order to be strong and full of muscle. But these guys have found that things that are closer to nature, more organic foods and plant foods really help improve performance. But it's an interesting book, and it's certainly an interesting story that this guy he still is, in fact, now he's retired, but he was probably one of the most accomplished triathletes in the world, and now does coaching and all. But it was through the concept of wholeness, mind, body, and spirit together, that he finally had his ultimate success, even though he was an incredible athlete to begin with. What took him to the level of dominance was really this idea of a more holistic approach and the idea of embracing mind, body, and spirit. So these are some things that came away from his work with the shaman, who again are sort of spiritual healers who connect the universe. And sometimes, a lot of times there's people that are critical of shamans, thinking that they many times will have some sort of psychic or sometimes even psychedelic plants and things might be part of their medicine bag, but they basically really celebrate the idea of cooperation with nature and living cooperation with family, friends in nature, and living in harmony with the spirit of nature, and the belief that everything is alive and has spirit: trees, flowers, mountains, lakes, rivers, and animals. So one of the wisdoms I'd share is to walk the earth. And again, I'm pretty big on walking and pretty big on the idea of being in nature. And of course, the photographs, I always like these photographs of walking in mountains and in valleys and, the grand landscapes. The bigger challenge, of course, is to be in an ordinary landscape and still perceive our connections with nature. But as we walk the earth, it heals our body, it heals our soul. It basically is food for us. And we are the space between the sky and the earth. The wisdom I heard recently is the sky doesn't really start above us, it actually starts below us, that the sky begins where our feet touches the earth. And so the earth gives us life and gives us a place to walk, and the sky gives us everything above our feet.
Ron, I really love that picture. If you can go back to it just 1 minute.
Sure.
That picture of that man. And
Okay, that's Oak Crown. Let's see. I think I can go back. Let's see. This way. Yeah, that's Mount Rainier in the background. And it's my son Dustin, actually.
Well, when I look at that picture and then what you asked of us about what is soul, and when I look at him, I think there's a lot more to us than our physical makeup. And is our soul kind of a consciousness that's beyond our physical giftedness, that helps us to ponder so much that we'd never get to if we were just physical parts, and that it's more than just our earth life, so to speak. I just find myself, as you've been sharing, I thought, I don't think anybody ever asked me, or I never asked anybody else, what is your soul? But we use that word an awful lot. So anyway, I just thought that picture shows so much soul of your son.
Yeah, so that's Mount Rainier in the background, of course, which is a volcano. And also it's on a place called the Wonderland Trail, which is a trail that goes around all of Mount Rainier. It's about 100 miles in time. And we shared this time together, and it was right before his first child was born. So it was a privileged time. And I don't know that we'll ever get a chance to spend a week sharing a tent together again in our lifetimes, in my lifetime anyway, because he has the responsibility of his family and all now. So really it makes me reflect on, we do need to pause at times and just get out of the compartments and the fast track that we're living on, the hamster wheel, and take a deep breath and pause and celebrate the moment in the day, and take the opportunity to do the things that we do when we can do them. This was kind of a poster along those ways. And again, I look for inspiration everywhere, and I have a whole refrigerator full of these refrigerator magnets. But this goes, this is your life. Do what you love and do it often. If you don't like something, change it. If you don't like your job, quit. If you don't have enough time, stop watching TV. If you're looking for love in your life, stop. They will be waiting for you when you start doing things that you love. Stop overanalyzing. All emotions are beautiful. When you eat, appreciate. Simple, life is simple. Every last bite. Open your mind, arms, and heart to new things and people. We are ignited in our differences. Ask the next person you see what their passion is and share your inspiring dream with them. Travel often. Getting lost will help you find yourself. Some opportunities only come once. Seize them. Life is about the people you meet and the things you create with them. So go out and start creating. Life is short. Live your dream and wear your passion. So I like these refrigerator things.
Yeah.
So look for the miracle in the ordinary. And this is on the beach of Lake Superior. Most of us living here maybe been there, but as you look at the general picture of the stones, you think those stones. And again, as we look at each other, sometimes we look at a group of people, it kind of is a big mass of what looks all the same. But as you pick up each stone and you look, you see a variety of colors and cracks and pits and tumbles, and you recognize that each stone is a little different. And I think we are all more alike than different, but we all have some special gift, and we all have something to offer each other. So to get over our differences and to break down the barriers between us as a people, the world is just a better place because we all have something to offer. And there's nobody that's a better us than we are. So look for the miracle in the ordinary and look for the miracle in every day. So I always think about the water turning into wine and the healing of the sick. But the reality is looking at your cat in the window on the couch. It's pretty amazing, the miracle of that cat's life and the beauty of its fur and the glow in its eye and the mischievousness in its heart sometimes. But we are often not pausing enough to appreciate the miracle of the day or the ordinary.
That's a cat.
What's that?
That's a cat with soul.
It's a cat with soul, you're right. Well, we're searching for a sense of purpose, and again, walking in grand landscapes help. And what is our purpose? I think a lot of people define their purpose as work, as what their career was, but particularly as they got closer to retirement, how important I recognized that, that can't be my sense of purpose, because otherwise you never want to stop working. And again, I didn't really want to stop working. It's just a matter of it's time to make the transition to the next thing. But our purpose is, it is what it is for all of us. But I think that some of it might be to love, to serve, to laugh, to live. We have the purpose of being a brother, a sister, a mother, a daughter, a neighbor. Our purpose is just to be here sharing this time together on our planet and in our community and with each other. So this is really a special time. And we do all have importance. To the world, we may be one person, but to one person, we may be the world. So the other question to ponder is, what is your purpose? And are we living our purpose? One of the things that I've been through some of these stress management workshops, et cetera, and they'll have you make a list of the 20 things that you really like to do. And then the next question always is, when was the last time you did those things? And of course, it's always an embarrassment when you write down 20 things that you really like to do, but then you put down the last time you did them was 10 years ago, So I think about that every day. One of my favorite stories is the story of the Chilkoot Pass Gold Rush, because in our own ways, we're all gold seekers. We're seeking our purpose, perhaps seeking love, seeking, our higher power. But just where you're at, that's the place to start. And the Chilkoot Pass story is so great because when gold was discovered in the Klondike, people just walked away from their houses and their loved ones, and they got their outfit and they started to hike over the Chilkoot Pass, and hoping to become rich and famous and find their gold. And to the disappointment of most of the Klondikers, by the time they got to the Klondike gold fields, there were no more gold claims to stake, and very few of those Klondikers actually became rich on gold. Some of them became rich economically, at least by becoming barkeeps and selling goods in the store, or maybe being craftsmen and building boats or something. But not that many of them really became rich finding gold. And when Pierre Burton, who was a Canadian author, interviewed some of the surviving Klondikers, this was about 20 years ago, and there still were some survivors, the story that they would tell, the most powerful, meaningful thing in their entire life, was really the journey. It was the struggle to get over the Chilkoot Pass. And so in our lives, I think that the journey is really the reward. And I've been reminded of that several times in my life. And it makes me think about, you can get to a mountaintop by being dropped off with a helicopter, and you probably appreciate the view and you say, boy, that's really beautiful. But I think that the joy of getting to the mountaintop is really amplified by the context of every footstep that you took to get to the mountaintop, and every deep breath that you took, and every time that the sweat dripped into your eyes and made your eyes water, that really is the reward of the journey. Another quotation that I always loved was Annie Dillard's quotation that goes, "How we spend our days, of course, is how we spend our lives." Also important as far as our mind-body-spirit connection is that of community. And it reminds me of the presentation recently about the trees and the forest, and how the forest actually, how the trees helped each other out, and how the forest was healthier because of each individual. So too, I think that we're better together than we are alone. So kind of the last, one of the last stories that I have before I get to a conclusion today is that comes from Mark Nepo, who is another spiritual writer, poet, and you'll see him on Super Soul Sunday with the Oprah program, and does presentations around. And he has a book called The Book of Awakenings. And actually, when my wife and I are having the very best day where we're able to drink coffee together, we do some spiritual readings, and then she reads out of this Mark Nepo book that's actually lined up based on dates. So about maybe a week or 10 days ago, she read this reading that I'm going to read to you right now, called The Way is Hard But Clear. So this is by Mark Nepo in his book that I just shared. And the story goes, the naturalist environmentalist Kevin Schneiber tells us that salmon make their way upstream by bumping repeatedly into blocked pathways until they find where the current is the strongest. Somehow they know that the unimpeded rush of water means that there's no obstacle there, and so they enter this openly, feverishly. For through it, though it's the hardest going, the way is clear. The lesson here is unnerving as it is helpful. In facing both inner and outer adversaries, the passage of truth comes at us with a powerful momentum because it is clear and unimpeded. And so where there's a sense of rush of truth is where we must give our all. As human beings, the blocked pathways of our journey can take many forms, and whether it be avoiding conflict with others, or in taking the risk to love, or in not accepting the call of spirit that would have us participate more fully in our days, it is easier to butt up against these blockage pathways than it is to enter feverishly into one passage that is so powerfully clear. In this regard, salmon innately model a healthy persistence by showing us how to keep nosing for the unimpeded way, and once finding it, how to work even harder to make it through. Some say it's easier for salmon, since the power of their drive is to end where they began, and it's not compromised by the endless considerations that often keep us from truth. Still, it is the heart's capacity to rise one more time after falling down, no matter how bruised, that verifies that such a drive lives in us too. Like salmon, our way depends not just on facing things head on, but in moving our whole being through. So he has reflections about this and then questions that he asked. But for today, simply feel the power of the way that is clear and keep it before you. I particularly liked it because, again, the idea of sometimes going through the hardest is what we need to do to get to where we're really going. And it has to do with the obstacles in our life and the things that get in the way of the truth. But also I could visualize the salmon because, again, in Alaska, watching the salmon migrate up the streams in the spawning season is an incredible sight to see. But Mark Nepo is a pretty talented writer, and I really like his stuff. And that was a story that spoke to me. And I think kind of ties in with the mind, body, spirit. The body of the salmon, the spirit of the salmon, going back to ending where it started. So we are many, we are one, and we are many, and we give and we receive. Our voice is the voice of the choir of many voices. And we hopefully live in a community, connected, compassionate, better together than alone. The other symbolic photograph that I like to share is Paul Gebhardt's 2006 Iditarod team. Paul Gebhardt was a perennial high finisher in the Iditarod sled dog race, and he had a great reputation for doing a good job of taking care of his dog team. In the last 2 years, he got a cancer diagnosis and has not been participating in the race, but he competed in about 30 Iditarods and always finished somewhere in the top 10. So here's a photograph of him going through a storm at a place called Igavik, which is outside of Unalakleet, where I was pretty familiar with, having lived in Unalakleet for a while. And it shows the dog team charging into the storm. And it says to me that, first off, the relationship between the musher, or the man and nature, or the man and the dog, is such a powerful relationship that the dogs are knowing that they're taken care of and they're loved for, and the better that Paul takes care of them, the better the dogs can perform. The other thing that I appreciate is the dogs are celebrating their sense of purpose, and we do perhaps something other than what our sense of purpose is in our lives or what our calling and passion is, because we need to survive. But if we can find our purpose and we find our passion and can make a living doing that, how wonderful our life is. That through gratitude is a pathway to happiness. The other part of the story I like, besides these dogs celebrating their sense of purpose and the relationship they have with Paul, is the fact that there's so much diversity in this dog team. There's white dogs and brown dogs and black dogs. There's old dogs and young dogs, and there's female dogs and male dogs, and they're all working together in the same direction. And what a celebration of community that is, if we all can embrace the gifts of each other and work shoulder to shoulder and strive in the same direction and have the shared caring and shared passion to do what we need to get through the storm and to get through our lives, how powerful it is. So to transition to a couple quotations as I come to a close. The God of the universe, the creator of nitrogen and pine needles, galaxies in E minor, loves us with a radical, unconditional, self-sacrificing love. And what is our typical response? We go to church, sing songs, and try not to cuss. So that was another refrigerator magnet quotation, which I thought was pretty good. But then it brings to mind this question for all of us to think about, and if anybody has something they'd like to share, what is our response to the God of the universe?
I guess I just have a real sense of awe, how God has brought into being the universe, each one of us. But to me, it's beyond words. It's just absolute awe.
Great. Yeah.
I cherish this moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. Yeah, and I go to church and try not to cuss, but also just this idea of living in gratitude, and also living with a foundation of kindness. You know, if we are just kind to each other, and you know, the world is just such a much more wonderful place, I think. So love is the energy that carries us forward. And this is a famous Jimi Hendrix quotation. I would have never thought this was a Jimi Hendrix quotation, but when I found this, it said Jimi Hendrix. So when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. Well, I'm thinking about the music, The Purple Haze, as I read that, but it's a great, fantastic quotation. For me, this is the gardening season, and I love having my fingers in the soil, but this was a pretty good, another quotation that your life is a garden and your thoughts are seeds. If your life isn't awesome, you've been watering weeds. And this is a quotation that I used to many times use. In fact, I always like to have a few things in my doctor's bag for my work in the clinic, and a lot of them had to do with these quotations I pull out, like the Annie Dillard quotation that how you live your days is how you live your life. But I also like this one because particularly as we get older in our life and we start to get to a point where we're living more our memories than we are our adventures, that it's easy to kind of get depressed and feeling down. So this was actually a quotation that was apparently some sort of African proverb, but it goes, when death finds you, may it find you alive. And so it is, again, living every day in gratitude and to make the most out of every moment that we have. I personally am feeling a little more sense of urgency to really make the most of every day, because I don't know if I'm going to, turn into a really old guy or just a little bit of an old guy. But the reality is I do appreciate that in my book of life that I'm getting towards the last chapters. So I don't want to waste as much time as I used to. And I do try to live with not only gratitude, but with urgency. And this was from Annie the Alchemist. You probably didn't know this, but at several points in your life, others have silently prayed for you. Some have sent you good vibes, and even angels disguised as humans or animals have stepped in to make you smile or heal in you in passing. Don't forget to pay it forward to someone else. Certainly prayer has got a lot of power, and that's another conversation for another whole talk, I suppose. But I do like the idea that the angels might be disguised as animals. A dream is that expansion of our being and our soul, going to stretch us past our previous limits. So this is my closing, and it's another story that I read which spoke to me and made me reflect. And it was a story about a woman from Australia who was visiting the U.S. and was staying with friends. And while she was in the U.S., she learned that the brush fires in Australia were endangering her house. And she called up a friend of hers in Australia and said, would you get these things out of my house, because my house is in the path of the fire and it's going to burn. So and again, the person that wrote the story had some reflections on it, what things this woman wanted taken out of her house and what this person who took them out of her house would take out if it was her house on fire. And it made me think about, what is so important to me that if my house was going to burn down, that I want to take out of it. And actually, I shared the story with my wife because I thought it was a good story. And she said, she lived in Florida during Hurricane Andrew, and they basically had the order to evacuate their house. So basically, they had to pack up the things that they wanted to pack up and move. So we've had that conversation, but maybe reflect on, what would I take, or what would you take if your house was going to burn, and how would you decide what to take? And I think that we can think about what we take out of our house, but it also makes me think about at this point in our lives, and if we think about that we're mortal and that we're all on the same journey to the eternal life, what do we want to give up in our lives now that we wouldn't want to take with us if we're moving on to the next place? And certainly I think that as we reflect on it, we want to get rid of the anger that we have. I mean, again, I'm just speaking for myself. We all have to reflect on this on our own, but get rid of anger, getting rid of the just getting beyond the traumas we may have suffered in our lives, giving up the excess, giving up stuff that we don't need. And there's a lot of things to embrace, and that is the idea of gratitude again. But I think that the idea that our house is on fire has as much a spiritual significance as it does a significance in terms of the actual burning of our house. Does anyone want to offer some reflections on that concept before I show the last couple of slides?
I want to make one suggestion.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Somewhere toward the beginning, you had the expression carrying what you need, and here talking about, what would you take, what do you need, and I think I'd like to see you work up a program carrying what you need, just from your experiences of backpacking and the Iditarod, and maybe some other experiences, but to take a look at what we carry and what do we need and what do we not need.
That's a great suggestion. I think it's.
I'd be interested.
Okay, well, thanks for that idea. I might work on it.
Yeah.
Anyone
Yeah,
else?
I'd be interested to hear your insights.
Sure. I take a lot less now than I used to when I was 20 years old and could handle more burden on my back. And also the wisdom I've changed.
Uh-huh.
So into the home, the last couple slides. One is, again, I like to begin every day with living in gratitude and trying to get to a prayerful, peaceful place. And it really helps me just move the day forward in a good way. And I do spend some time with deep breathing. But again, this isn't really about my journey and winters of heavy snow, but it really has to do with just some of the work some of my practice in terms of trying to make the day as good as it can be and to live in gratitude. But the other wisdoms that I really like are these wisdoms of Don Miguel Ruiz of the Four Agreements, and the idea of being impeccable with your word, not taking things personally, don't make assumptions, and to communicate and to always do our best. And again, these are pretty universally known, and I guess I won't read them, but I just toss it out there, and many of you may have seen him. If not, it's a good read, and he's another guy who sort of brings some wisdoms forward from indigenous people that are good wisdoms for all of us to carry. And some of these are very hard to do, particularly not taking things personally. So, and just the concept of always doing your best. The corollary for me to always doing your best is to really believe that everybody else is doing their best also. And even though, again, it may disappoint me in some way personally, which I shouldn't take it personally anyway, but that, all of us are probably doing the best we can with what our upbringing has been or what our belief system is or the foundation that we carry in our lives. But the Four Agreements are, I think, a powerful reflection and a good foundation for our days. So the last slide I have is my favorite prayer that I also start the day with, but we're going to end the day with the prayer of St. Francis. And certainly say this with me if you like. I'll go ahead and read it, but again, I just like to put this in my presentations because it's the work I try to do on a daily basis. And I certainly fall short on a regular basis, and I'm long ways away from hopefully I'm not too far away from maybe going to heaven when I die, but I think I'm a long ways away from becoming a saint. So, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me still love.
Let me so love.
Let me so love. Where there is
Doubt,
faith.
where there is despair, where there is darkness, light, where there is
Light. Where there's sadness, joy.
grant that I may not to be
Grant that I may so much seek to be consoled as to console,
Console.
to be understood as to understand,
to be loved, to
to
love.
be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life.
Well, that's my presentation today, and again, it was such a privilege to be part of this with everyone. I'm going to see if I can get back to the screen for the Zoom screen. See.
Ron,
there we go.
thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Ron, thank you so very
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
You got to do this again some another time for others.
Sure. Grant, as far as this record function on Zoom, how would a person see this on the record? Do they just go to the Zoom site and then play it?
What I have done is I recorded, we were about 10 minutes into the session before I thought to hit record.
Okay.
But I'll put it up and get you the link, and everybody that participated in this, the link. There will be an audio link and a video link. And we've been keeping them up for about 6 to 8 weeks. So with your permission, Ron, however you want to disperse it, or if you want to keep it within the group, or...
No, in fact, I think, I mean, the more the better is, again, not that I feel any sort of divine wisdoms that other people don't, maybe have in their own hearts. But, if even one of the quotations, like the God of the universe with pine needles and nitrogen, offers an inspiration to somebody, I feel as though it's worth sharing. So it can be, generally released to the public from my perspective. Sure,
we can do that. And I know for myself, you've given me about 10 books that I want to open up now.
Okay. Well, I think the more I practice with Zoom, the better it'll be probably, but it's a kind of a powerful tool. So I'm happy about that.
Did great.
Yeah.
Lovely presentation.
You did great.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for participating. I appreciate it.
And such good questions to ponder. Thank you. I'm glad that we'll have the recording so I can go back over and do more reflection. You always ask wonderful questions, Ron.
Thanks.
And provide great context. Thank you.
Okay,
A lot of
great.
wisdom, a lot of wisdom.
Mhm.
Great. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yes, I was going to say, in another culture, you'd be called an elder because of your wisdom.
Yeah, well, I appreciate
And
that.
it's nice to see you again, Jan.
Yeah, it's good to see everybody here too, and I'll be connecting in some more programs in the future. I hope so.
Yeah.
All right.
Keep the word. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you.
Right there,
Thank you
elder
all.
Ron. Thanks, Grant.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Bye. Bye.